you can go back and look at it. And so that anybody who may not have been able to make it will be able to go back and look at it. And if all goes well, I will be able to send that link out to everybody sometime this evening, if everything goes well on the recording and uploading. So I'll send you an email out with that. I think time before last, I was telling you about our Zoom etiquette, which is a little different than other face-to-face meetings, and it's challenging when you're on Zoom. And one of the difficulties that I have is that when I am the one that's teaching and I'm sharing the screen, in order to see my full screen, I have to move everybody off of the screen so I don't see any of you. So if there's something that you need, if you need to ask something or ask for clarification, or if you need to correct me, that's certainly a possibility. Just unmute and get my attention. I do want to share with you a couple of things that Marcia Bowers made for me today. I'm getting ready to teach Clean Water U in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be doing that by Zoom. And I told her, I said, I need some little handheld reactions that I can use so I don't have to go down in the bottom and look for reactions. And she made me 2 more today. I'll just give you a quick peek at those. Here's the thoughtful look when I'm trying to come up with an answer. And hopefully I won't have to use this one too many times. But Marcia made those for me, so I appreciate her helping out. All right. There was a video at the end of last week's session, and we kind of ran out of time to discuss that. So I want to point out just a couple of things that are in that video, and you can go back and watch the end of the session if you want to see that video later. If you don't have that link, I can send it to you. But I love the way the lady who was doing the talking pointed out how Nehemiah, or Nehemiah, as she called him, how he leveled the toxic and drastically tilted economic playing field in post-exilic Jerusalem, and how she said, you know, that perhaps could have been one of the earliest or first observances of the ancient call to Jubilee that the Israelites got in the wilderness, where you were supposed to forgive debt and return people's property and do things like that every 7 years and every 50 years. So I appreciated her bringing that up. And also, I find it interesting that the intermarriage with folks who speak different languages seems to be one of the factors that led to the need for translating the ancient Hebrew scriptures into a more common language. And of course, that was Greek. So I want to start tonight with basic dates for some of the major events that occurred in and around Palestine after most of the Hebrew Bible texts that we have were written during what they call the time in between the Testaments. So now I am going to share the screen here, get my sound shared, and somewhere down here will be what I want. And there it is. So there now. All right, let's see if we can get going here. I just want to drop back on something that we really haven't talked about, and just very briefly talk about the differences that are so significant in our text. It's important to remember that the texts that we claim as part of our Bible were not posted to a church website for posterity. They weren't emailed to everyone or even taken down to Staples or Kinko's for copying and distribution. It may be hard to believe, but that wasn't available. And the only way they survived is by being hand copied over and over and over again, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, with whatever paper and ink happened to be currently available. They were copied not in notebooks with pages, but on long pieces of paper like papyrus or some other fragile plant material that was processed into scroll-like forms. And Dr. Williams can tell you a lot more about that. Those of you who did the Dead Sea Scrolls study with him probably know a lot more than I do now about that. But I just have to remind myself sometimes that there was no backspace or delete key, no eraser. And in a lot of cases, there probably wasn't an editorial desk that compared the latest handwritten copy to the last copy, however old and fragile it was. So fragment is the key word in the biblical archaeologist's never-ending task of providing us the latest finds of the oldest text. Now, within the last 10 days, the most recent news about finds Dead Sea Scroll fragments includes the unearthing of this, what one article called an intricately woven basket dating back to the Neolithic period. That's really old. I think that's about 1,000 years before the invention of pottery. This is a 26-gallon basket that's still in existence. That would be quite a laundry basket to haul around. I'm sure they carried more than laundry in it, but anyway, this stuff is always being found, and sometimes some of the stuff that's found is very helpful in helping us understand what text we have, where they came from, and how it is that we might best understand them. But when we last left what you might call the chronological slingshot last week, we were approaching the beginning of the 4th century BC, or BCE as it is called, where Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, and Malachi had already at least been written. So there's where we left off kind of last time in the timeline wise. And so now I want you to put on your time travel shoes so we can walk through some influential times and people. As we talked last time, the Persians maintained primary influence and control over Jerusalem and what we call the Holy Land and the Jewish people from somewhere around 450 BC until the mid-300s BC. Let's take a look at some of the key dates and key figures who had geopolitical influence in the Holy Land following this period of Persian influence and the first rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. So one of the key figures that is often talked about is Philip II. And in 359, he took the throne of the Kingdom of Macedon, and we'll look at a map of that in just a minute so you can locate that. Before we get the map, though, we have to know important things about Philip, like, for instance, in 357, the royal wedding with Philip and Olympias was pretty important. And also during that same year, as a part of one of his conquests, he renamed one of the cities. I'm not even sure how you pronounce the city beforehand. Crenides, maybe Crenides, I don't know. But anyway, he renamed it Philippi because, of course, everybody needs a town named after them, right? 356, his son Alexander III is born. And for much of the 350s, before Alexander was born and after, Philip was in war, and more war. He didn't win all of them, but he won most of them. And in the end, he ended up being fairly victorious. So let's take a quick look at the early part of his kingdom. Here's a map here, and you see the red area in the center is basically Macedonia. And if you'll notice, there's a black line that runs around the western edge and the northern edge, but through parts of the northeast and across the south. And that was the original ethnic Macedonian territory. So early on in his conquest, he had already added some territory, hadn't really made it down far into Greece or up in the west or down in, up in the east or down in the southwest. So this is the early conquest of Philip. And so we go back to a few dates here. Between 343 and 338, Philip managed to get the Greek philosopher Aristotle to tutor his teenage son Alexander from roughly the ages of 13 to 16 in subjects including philosophy, medicine, and scientific investigation. But these weren't the only subjects that Alexander studied, because Aristotle wasn't Alexander's only influential teacher. He had others. He also learned to read, to write, which very few people knew how to do, and also to play a musical instrument. He learned to play the lyre, as well as studying and practicing military strategy and undergoing the discipline of long, difficult military marches. And as we get into Alexander's life, you'll see how that paid off for him. In 336, Philip was assassinated. So the end of his kingdom looked something like this. This would be the final look of his kingdom. You'll notice there's a lot more red there. He's got Greece and on down into Corinth, all the way almost down to Sparta. That whole northeastern region that was not a part of their map early on by 336 is a part of his kingdom. So you see this kingdom has grown fairly consistently. And so 20-year-old Alexander takes the throne and has a sizable and powerful Macedonian empire. But now this is not Alexander's first rodeo. He's already been a military leader since he was 18 years old. For at least 2 years, he was left in charge of the homeland of Macedonia while his father Philip went to war against Byzantium. And Alexander's forces, the ones that he led, actually were key players in Philip's Macedonian victory over the Greeks. So after his father's death, Alexander promptly killed all his rivals and also finished subduing the defiant Greek states that his father had struggled with for years. And those newly tamed Greek states agreed to supply Alexander with troops for his next planned conquest, which was Persia. So he takes the throne in 336. And then in 334, he has his first great military victory as the king, where he defeats the Persian king Darius III, thus putting this former nation of Israel, who was under Darius, into the mix for his kingdom. Both the Judeans in Jerusalem and the mixture of folks scattered across the northern territory of Samaria had to decide whether they would acquiesce or rebel. In 332 BC, as Alexander was on his way to Tyre in Egypt, he marched through Samaria, declared himself their ruler, and they pretty much said, okay, you're the king. He won handily and easily, and that gave him more opportunity to move toward Tyre and Egypt. There was a story about in Samaria in the northern kingdom who initially supported Alexander. After he moved on to Egypt, Samaria changed its mind, and apparently they rebelled and burned the governor that Alexander had appointed alive. So you can imagine that didn't go over well. And part of his retribution for that, his punitive response, was to send a number of Macedonians to move into and take over Samaria. So Alexander permitted the Jews to observe their laws and even granted them exemption from tribute or tax during their Sabbath years. When he built Alexandria in Egypt, he encouraged Jews to live there and gave them some of the same privileges in Alexandria that his Greek subjects had. And quite honestly, the Greek conquest of Palestine prepared the way, as we talked last week a little bit, getting ahead of ourselves, for the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint version that was in use for so long. So Alexander conquered Tyre in Egypt, and of course he founded the city of Alexandria because, of course, every conqueror needs a major city named after him, doesn't he? Then in over the years 331 to 329 BC, because Alexander had spent so much time going toward Egypt and moving around to different places, Darius was able to regroup his forces. And so over that period of time, Alexander had to defeat him for a second time. And after he did that, he declared himself to be the king of Asia. And since there was no one to challenge him, he was. And then, of course, all of Persia's wealth was used then to fund further expeditions that he had, because he didn't think he was anywhere near through expanding the empire. So let's take a little bit of a time travel pause here to think about Alexander's game plan and how he carried it out, because I think that's significant as we look at the influences that were on Palestine at the time when the New Testament was written. This is the detail of a mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii, the National Archaeological Museum, and that's supposed to be Alexander. He's got the big eye staring at somebody, whoever he's battling with here. Ever the educated conqueror, Alexander had a big picture dream of incorporating and unifying all of the diverse kingdom he subdued with two major tools. From what he had learned from Aristotle and all of his teachers, he realized that there were two major things that he needed to do to help solidify and unify his kingdom. The first one was to create city-states wherever his territories were, so that they were governed appropriately and so that they were civilized. And the second thing that he spent a lot of time and energy focusing on was the establishment of one shared language. And of course, that language was Greek. By way of his understanding of both how the world worked and how he ruled, not really taking into account his military tactics, which were obviously better than anybody else's, but his ruling tactics. He also considered religion to be sort of subsumed within these two major tools, city-states and language. And in order to carry out this unifying process, his conquering entourage would include surveyors and engineers and architects and scientists and court officials and historians. All of those traveled with him and helped him to set up these city-states and to help spread the language. It appears obvious that he clearly saw the Greek culture, which had been introduced to him by Aristotle and others, as superior. And rather than forcing it on people, he used Aristotle's teaching method. He introduced it to these areas that he had conquered and invited them to take on the Greek culture. He didn't force it all on them at once. but he was also not above incorporating elements of the cultures that he conquered, most likely as an enticement for people to reciprocate and assimilate into a lot of the Greek culture, which would help him. As an example of that, after he defeated Persia the second and final time, he decided to adopt a Persian style wardrobe. So apparently he went shopping at Saks Fifth Avenue in Persia and changed his whole wardrobe to match the Persians as a way to entice them to adopt Greek culture. As historians often describe it, Alexander's approach to unifying his newly forming empire was not entirely successful on people who had strong ties to their own geography and their own cities, and who had deeply entrenched and connected religion. And I'd say that would be a pretty good description of the Jews around Jerusalem. And so Alexander struggled with how to deal with them. Go back and pick up just a couple of more dates here before we go on to some other stuff. In 324, he went back to Susa, the administrative center of his new Persian empire, and conducted a mass marriage ceremony between his Macedonian soldiers and Persian women. Now, any bets on whether or not the Persian women had any say in this? I'm guessing the answer to that was a very strong no. We're back to the same religious problem that our lecturer at the end of last week talked about Nehemiah facing when the Persians allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This whole thing of intermarriage that made it difficult for them to maintain their faith. So after subduing Persia for what would turn out to be the final time, Alexander continued his conquest, including into what we now know as Afghanistan, India, the western part of Pakistan, before finally heading home. And from the best I can tell in the histories I've read, he wasn't really ready to go home, but his soldiers decided that they were. And by refusing to go any farther, they convinced him to turn around and come back home. So in 323, when he was headed back home by way of Babylon, Alexander contracted a mysterious fever. Some scholars believe it was possibly something like malaria. And there in Babylon, he died suddenly and unexpectedly. Not a very long reign, but a lot of ground covered. So here's how Alexander changed the map in 13 brief years of his reign. And remember now, this would be between the time he was 20 years old and his death at about 33. So in 13 years, this was the expanded empire of Alexander the Great. Now, just to give you a little size comparison and reference, I'm going to draw a circle around the map of the part of what his father gave him. Okay, circle, go on. So that's what he started out with. And all of this area in the green, in just 13 years, he managed to conquer and take over. Alexander's empire was the largest, obviously, that the world had ever known. And Greek culture was and still is a major influence on the Western world. The Greek language, as far and wide as it spread, gave some of the early Christian missionaries a common language by which their message could be spread. So not having to learn a new language when they went to some of the other territory, being able to use the common language of Greek that the whole empire shared, was a great advantage for those who were seeking to spread the gospel. Now, even though Palestine, the Holy Land, was not the key issue facing the Greeks after Alexander's death, really Israel became a pawn in the struggle. Don't know if you can see down here at the bottom there at the southeastern part of the Mediterranean Sea where Israel is, so that you see between Egypt and all these routes to the rest of the kingdom here, the primary way of getting through, if you were staying in the kingdom, was to come right through Israel and Jerusalem. So Israel became sort of a pawn in some of the struggles, and the major issue that the kingdom faced after Alexander's sudden death was who would be his successor. Who could have predicted that such a force of geopolitical and military cultural influence would drop dead at the age of 33? Nobody was really prepared for this. And so with no heir apparent, 7 of his major generals, which ended up being 4 by the time it was all said and done, tried to convene to decide the fate of his massive empire. Now, I'm pretty sure I've talked too much already tonight. And so I want to shift vehicles because there's a very brief lecture here that I hope will help you tie together some of the things I've shared with you about Alexander's brief moment in the sun and in the geopolitical spotlight. And it will also provide you with a helpful introduction to what will become the post-Alexander Empire, which we will begin walking through at the beginning of next week. So if you would, make sure you got the volume turned up so you can hear this video, and let's see how this all lays out.
Not sure who the Macedonians are, what they have to do with Jewish history, or why their name sounds like a tree nut? Don't fret, because I'm here to fill you in on everything. Between the reign of Alexander the Great and the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, Jewish leaders are forced to make historic sacrifices for their religious freedom and authority. Under Greek influence and oppression, these heroes stand up for their Jewish values to the point of death, and people like Mattathias and Judah Maccabee, and Hannah and her 7 sons are memorialized for centuries afterwards. Many wars are fought, and conflicts abound, even within the community. But the Jewish people persevere, fighting for their religious and political freedom. If you're like me, you might avoid someone who ends their name with the title, the Great. But ego trip aside, Alexander is actually pretty good to the Jewish people. When he conquers Jerusalem in 332 BCE, he becomes the only conqueror in 1,000 years who does not order the city to be destroyed. Much of the Jewish community loves him for it, and suddenly there are a bunch of Jewish Federation buildings named in his honor. But upon his death, 11 years later, a fight breaks out between Alexander's generals over his succession. On the right side of the ring is Seleucus, who establishes a dynasty in the area now known as Syria. On the left side of the ring is Ptolemy, who establishes rule in Egypt. They battle for control over the Jewish state of Judea, changing leadership at least 5 times over the next 30 years. Eventually, Egypt wins rulership and holds the title for the next 100 years until 198 BCE, when Antiochus III reconquers Judea for the Seleucids. During the reign of Antiochus III, Judea is still under its own autonomous province under Jewish rule. It's under watch, but in control, like a teenager with a new driver's license. At the center of this province is Jerusalem, where the high priest of the temple acts as both religious and political leader, along with the council of elders, or Gerousia, who hold authority on certain matters. But similar to the areas of Egypt and Syria under the Macedonian Empire, Greek Hellenist culture becomes a prominent part of the conquered people of Judea. Many Hellenist Jews start taking Greek names, wearing Greek clothing, and joining the AE Pi frat. Greek becomes the language of administration and literature. Many Jewish people even begin to study the Bible in Greek, the ultimate sign of integration into Greek culture. However, not all Jews are aboard the moussaka and lamb train. Even though the temple in Jerusalem still acts as the religious, political, and social focal point of the province, many feel that the religious capital has lost its holiness to paganism and idolatry. Non-Jewish settlers have brought their idols, and the Hellenist Jews do nothing to stop them. A gymnasium is established in Jerusalem, a hallmark of Greek metropolis and social life, and begins to replace the temple as the Mecca of the province. Many Jews are offended by the desecration of their holy sites and by the Hellenistic emphasis on the physical, which clashes with their religious emphasis on the spiritual. Other Jews, like me, just don't like the pressure of going to the gym. Deepening this gap with Greek culture is the succession of power from Antiochus III to his son Antiochus IV. Number 4 is not as tolerant to the Jews as his father was. He forces the people to assimilate and punishes death upon those who refuse. In time, even the temple begins to succumb to Greek influence. The high priesthood, normally passed down through Aaron's family lineage, is taken over by a Hellenist named Menelaus, who murders the previous high priest and steals money and treasures from the temple to appease the king. Many of the Hellenist Jews support these maneuvers and may have even suggested them to Antiochus IV. Many observant Jews, however, feel that the foundation of their religion is threatened. Among the latter group are Mattathias and his family, the Hasmoneans, who leave Jerusalem for the safety of the surrounding towns and hills to gather the seeds for Jewish resistance. Antiochus IV begins to up the ante on Jewish oppression. He orders Jews to make sacrifices to Greek gods and desecrate the Sabbath. He forbids circumcision of newborn sons, study of the Bible, and any observance of the Torah, making these Jewish actions punishable by death. By outlawing these distinct pillars of Jewish life, Antiochus introduces a new type of danger to the Jewish people. Not the physical, genocidal anti-Semitism seen before, but rather a cultural anti-Semitism that threatens to destroy the Jewish religion. The biggest of these cultural threats to the Jewish people? Bacon. One man named Eleazar understands the greater danger posed by these decrees and sets an example of defiance. Antiochus himself orders Eleazar to eat a pig, a major transgression in the Bible. But Eleazar knows that any offense is a threat to his community, and even something as small as an Egg McMuffin is a symbol of humiliation that a Jew has abandoned their beliefs. So Eleazar bravely chooses to defy Antiochus and defends his religion. He refuses to eat the pig. As punishment, Eleazar is tortured to death. Witnessing this act of defiance, another family of martyrs stands up against the king. A woman named Hannah and her 7 sons are also ordered to eat pig, but they too choose death. One by one, each of the sons is tortured and killed until Hannah herself submits to the same fate. This story of defiance is so powerful that later even Christian Europe begins to celebrate these 7 martyrs, making them the symbol of heroism, and Antiochus the symbol of the Antichrist. But back in Judea, Antiochus can't stop and won't stop. His efforts toward Jewish oppression continue throughout the country, and the same decree makes its way to Mattathias and his 5 sons in the city of Modin. A group of soldiers stand before the town and order every Jew to sacrifice a pig to Zeus and then eat its flesh. As the villagers listen in horror, Mattathias and his sons stand before them and refuse to submit. They cry out that they will not turn aside from religion. Only this time, instead of accepting death, Mattathias and his sons seize the soldiers and kick the altar to the ground. They stab and kill the soldiers. The Maccabees have started a revolt. That's right.
All right, so that gets us up to the Maccabean revolt, and we'll talk more about that next week as we go. But what I want to do is make a shift, kind of a detour again, like we did last week, and take a look at one of the apocryphal writings. And the one I want for us to consider tonight is the one that's one of the books that's titled Esdras, or in the Greek, Ezra. This book contains an alternate form of the text of chapters 35 and 36 in 2nd Chronicles. It contains a different text for the first 10 chapters of the book of Ezra. And it also contains a new section for the last verse in chapter 7 of Nehemiah and the first 13 verses in chapter 8. So if you wanted to compare those, you could go read from your, what you call the Presbyterian Bible, I guess, and then go read these apocryphal versions from that. and see what the differences are. But what I want to look at tonight is another account that is not listed and written anywhere in the scriptures that we normally use. And that would be chapters 3:1 through the 6th verse in chapter 5 of First Esdras, and it is commonly called the contest of the bodyguards. So we're going to look at a part of the contest of the bodyguards. So here's how the story goes. Unbeknownst to King Darius, who is asleep after giving a big feast and festival for some of his Persian finest, 3 of his bodyguards concoct a contest between themselves to see who could win. And the king knows nothing about this, but they've already decided that whichever one of them wins is going to get fine clothing, a gold bed, some jewelry, and most importantly, they will be exalted with a title, kinsman to the king. So after they dream up this contest, they put it in writing and secretly slip it under the king's pillow while he is asleep for him to find when he wakes up. Here's the contest that the bodyguards wanted to do. Each of the bodyguards had to decide for himself what was the one thing in the whole world that was stronger than any other thing. And they were to write down that one thing without anybody else seeing it and seal it in some sort of envelope, so to speak, and then put that under the king's pillow for the king to decide which one of them was right. What is the strongest thing there is? So the king, they decided, who would be aided by 3 of his leading Persian officials who happened to be there for the big festival, would, after he waked up and heard their descriptions of why they believed their choice was the strongest of all things, they would decide who had given the best answer and award the prize. Now, where you are at your home or wherever you're gathered, if you have a piece of paper and something to write with, or even a device you can write a note on, I'm going to wait for a minute here and let you think about what you would write down as your answer to the strongest thing in the world. So I'm going to give you just a few seconds to do that. Okay, we're not going to waste a lot of time with that. And I have to tell you, I don't have any fine clothing or a gold bed or jewelry or no exalted title for you if you happen to win. But drum roll, please. Here is what the bodyguards wrote. The first bodyguard said wine was the strongest thing in the world. The second bodyguard said that the emperor or the king was the strongest thing in the world. But the third bodyguard said women. Well, let's make that truth. So the third bodyguard got to write down 2 answers, which kind of reminds me of the trivia night we had a while back, where some of the folks seemed to have a little advantage in what was going on. We won't go there though. So what I want to do is I want to read for you from this Good News translation of the Apocrypha, the descriptions that these 3 bodyguards gave when they were told to describe why they thought the thing they picked was the strongest in the world. So from the first bodyguard, who said wine was the strongest thing in the world, let me read you what he said. This is how it's translated. Gentlemen, wine is clearly the strongest thing in the world. It confuses the mind of everyone who drinks it. It has exactly the same effect on everyone, king or orphan, slave or free, rich or poor. It makes every thought happy and carefree and makes one forget every sorrow and responsibility. It makes everyone feel rich. It makes them ignore the power of the kings and officials, and it makes them talk as if they owned the whole world. Okay. The second bodyguard said, oh, the emperor or the king is obviously the most powerful thing in the world. So from chapter 4, here's how the second bodyguard made his argument. Gentlemen, he said, nothing in the world is stronger than men, since they rule over land and sea, and in fact over everything in the world. But the emperor is the strongest of them all. He is their Lord and master, and men obey him no matter what he commands. If he tells them to make war one on another, they do it. If he sends them out against his enemies, they go, even if they have to break down mountains or walls or towers. They may kill or be killed, but they never disobey the emperor's orders. If they are victorious, they bring him all their loot and everything else they have taken in battle. But the third bodyguard said this. And the third bodyguard was identified as Zerubbabel. He spoke last, and he said, gentlemen, the emperor is certainly powerful, men are numerous, and wine is strong. But who rules and controls them all? It is women. Women give birth to the emperor and all the men who rule over the land and sea. Women brought them into the world. Women brought up the men who planted the vineyards from which wine comes. Women make the clothes that men wear. Women bring honor to men. In fact, without women, men couldn't live. Men may accumulate silver or gold or other beautiful things, but if they see a woman with a pretty face or a good figure, they will leave it all to gape and stare, and they will desire her more than their wealth. A man will leave his own father and mother and his country to spend the rest of his life with his wife. So you must recognize that women are your masters. Don't you work and sweat and then take all that you have earned and give to your wives. A man will take his sword and go out to attack, rob, and steal and sail the seas and rivers. He may have to face lions or travel in the dark, but when he has robbed, stolen, and plundered, he will bring the loot home to the woman he loves. And he goes on and talks about that for a while, but then, because he gets a second try, because he wrote down 2 answers, then he shifts his conversation toward truth as being the strongest thing. He said, yes, women are very strong, but think of how big the earth is, how high the sky is. Think of how fast the sun moves as it rapidly circles the whole sky in a single day. If the sun can do this, it is certainly great. But truth is greater and stronger than all of these things. Everyone on earth honors truth. Heaven praises it. All creation trembles in awe before it. There is not the slightest injustice in truth. You will find injustice in wine, in the emperor, in women, in all human beings, in all they do, and in everything else. There is no truth in them. They are unjust and they will perish, but truth endures and is always strong. It will continue to live and reign forever. Truth shows no partiality or favoritism. It does what is right rather than what is unjust or evil. Everyone approves what truth does. Its decisions are always fair. Truth is strong, royal, powerful, and majestic forever. Let all things praise the God of truth. Now, anybody want to guess which one of these bodyguards won? I will read for you the answer. The very next verse. when Zerubbabel had finished speaking, all the people, the text says, shouted this: "Truth is great. There is nothing stronger." So there you go. We all knew that, right? Truth is stronger than anything. Doesn't always feel that way, but apparently it's supposed to be. All right, I see we have about come to the end of our hour together. And so next week, when we pick back up again, we'll be looking more at the post-Alexander Empire of Macedonia. And then we'll eventually move on into the Roman conquest and look at more of the apocryphal books. But thank you all for putting up with my yammering.
Thank you.
Thank you.